The drizzle had thickened by mid-morning, a fine, insinuating mist that persuaded respectable people to linger indoors and less respectable ones to appear busy wherever warmth could be found. From the bakery window opposite St. Swithin's, Mrs. Stillingfleet maintained her customary surveillance of the town's moral temperature, which, she often said, had declined steadily since the introduction of supermarket bread. The spectacle of the church bell's unauthorized enthusiasm had given her an entire morning's worth of conversational yeast, and by the time the clock above the corn exchange struck noon, she had already informed 6 customers, 3 passers-by, and 1 disinterested cat that the culprit was no doubt someone with unfinished business in the next world. Inside the church, the scent of lilies and damp wool mingled unpleasantly as mourners reassembled with a sort of weary defiance. The Reverend Tukes adjusted his stole and muttered a prayer not included in the liturgy. He was a tall, well-constructed man whose voice always implied that life might be simpler if only people would agree with him. He now performed the final blessings in a tone that suggested he personally forgave the bell, though not its ringer. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, had not left the scene. He lingered near the vestry door, appearing to be one of those rare policemen whose patience expanded in proportion to other people's fuss. A bell that rang when it shouldn't was, in Flaxborough terms, not a catastrophe but a conversation starter, and conversations, Purbright knew, were often more revealing than fingerprints. He had already spoken briefly to the sexton, a stooped man named Pratt, with a voice like creaking floorboards. Pratt swore on his rheumatism that he'd locked the tower before the service and checked it twice after the rehearsal. "Nobody gets in that way, sir. Not unless they've wings or the vicar's key." "Does the vicar keep his key close?" Purbright asked. "Close enough, I'd say. Sleeps with the thing on his bedside table, he does. Says the church ought never to be shut against the needy." Purbright smiled faintly. "And yet, it often is." The sexton coughed, uncertain if this was a question or a philosophical remark. "Well, that's clergy for you," he muttered, and went off to polish a spade with unnecessary energy. Purbright turned his gaze toward the tower steps, damp and narrow, where faint traces of something pale clung to the first few stones. Flour, perhaps, or plaster, but plaster had no scent, and this did. He stooped, rubbed the residue between thumb and forefinger, and noted the faint, yeasty tang that carried even through the church's damp air. He said nothing, but his eyes briefly lifted to the window of the bakery opposite, where Mrs. Stillingfleet was engaged in the strenuous act of appearing not to watch him. By late afternoon, the incident had blossomed into legend. In the snug of the King's Arms, 3 men who hadn't attended the funeral offered competing explanations, each more elaborate than the last. The bell rope, they said, might have been tampered with by pigeons trained for sabotage, or perhaps by that new delivery boy from the bakery, Shifty Eyes, that one. A woman at the next table proposed a ghostly motive, citing an old saying that bells ring for sins unconfessed. Her husband, who had several, drank quickly and changed the subject. Purbright appeared at the King's Arms not long after, ordered a half-pint of mild and listened without intruding. The townspeople, he knew, would reveal far more when they thought the police already knew everything. When Mrs. Stillingfleet entered, her apron hastily folded beneath a coat of impractical fur, the conversation froze and reassembled around her. She carried herself like a witness summoned by destiny. "I saw him," she began, lowering her voice just enough to imply danger. "Right after the bell started. Tall fellow, brown coat, running from the gate. I told Marion to remember his face." "Describe him, then," Purbright said pleasantly, as though he had merely wandered by coincidence into her performance. "Well, taller than average, perhaps foreign-looking, though we've had plenty of that lately. You know, not from here." Purbright nodded as if this narrowed things down. "Did he seem in a hurry to leave town?" She frowned. "No, not exactly. More guilty of something." "You can always tell." He thanked her politely, promised to note it carefully, and returned to his drink. The description, he reflected, would fit half the town, himself included, and still fall short of any practical use. But her certainty about the guilt, that was interesting. People rarely saw guilt. They recognized reflection of their own suspicions. At the station that evening, Sergeant Malley brought in the lock from the tower door. "No scratches, sir. Looks like the key did its job." "Then whoever rang the bell either had one," Purbright murmured, "or didn't need it." Malley frowned. "How's that?" "People sometimes find the simplest ways in when everyone else is busy looking for the clever ones." Through the office window, the lamps of Flaxborough shimmered in the mist, each one making the drizzle appear finer, softer, and somehow more secretive. Purbright noted the time, just past 7, and wrote 2 words in his small notebook. "Flower, keys." He closed it gently, as if the act of doing so might prevent the town from inventing new theories before morning. But even as he did, somewhere down in the high street, the faint clatter of a baker's latch being drawn and the sound of a distant bell rope settling back into place seemed to whisper that the dead man's funeral was not the only matter. The town had yet to lay to rest. By the next morning, Mrs. Stillingfleet had made the mystery of the bell entirely her own. It was, in her mind, less a matter of local disturbance and more a personal affront, a deliberate challenge to her reputation as the town's foremost moral barometer. After all, if the church could ring its bell without her consent or foreknowledge, what next? A wedding announced without cake. She had spent the early hours recounting the events to her assistant Marion, each repetition gaining new confidence and fresh embellishment. By her third telling, she had clearly seen the ringer's face. By the 5th, she could describe the color of his gloves. "Brown leather," she said firmly, icing a bun with unnecessary force. Like a man who works outdoors but pretends not to. Marion, who had learned the wisdom of quiet endurance, merely nodded and kept her attention on the tray. The bell had become a town obsession overnight. Even the delivery boys spoke of little else, and the butcher's apprentice claimed to have heard that a ghostly hand had been seen pulling the rope. "Oh, nonsense," Mrs. Stillingfleet had declared upon hearing this. If it was a ghost, it would have had better timing. Across the street, the church remained solemnly closed, its doors locked and its vicar indisposed. The Reverend Tukes had announced through his housekeeper that he was suffering spiritual exhaustion, which most residents took to mean that he wished to avoid conversation until someone else could be blamed. Purbright, ever patient, made no announcement at all. He simply appeared again that morning without fuss, without uniform, and walked into the bakery at precisely 10:30. Mrs. Stillingfleet greeted him as one might greet a guest who had arrived late to her own dinner party. "Inspector, I was beginning to think you'd given up entirely." Purbright smiled. "I thought it better to let events settle a little, Mrs. Stillingfleet. Flour takes time to rise properly." She laughed, uncertain if she'd been complimented or insulted. "Well, you won't find much rising here today. The town's gone mad, you know. That bell's bewitched everyone. Poor Marion hasn't stopped talking about it." Marion, startled mid-icing, said nothing. Purbright removed his hat and glanced toward the counter. "A strange business indeed. I understand you saw someone leaving the churchyard." "I did," she said promptly, delighted to reprise her role. "A man, as I told you yesterday, brown coat, tall, a certain guilty air about him. I dare say he's not been back since." "You're quite sure he came from the gate?" "From the church direction, yes. You know what they say about intuition?" "They do," Purbright said mildly. "Though it's curious, there were fresh shoe marks by the gate, smaller than a man's, and some flour on the latch, which seems to have come from your side of the street." Her hands froze on the dough. "Flour? Oh, surely not mine." "I keep a clean establishment, Inspector." "I've never doubted it," Purbright said kindly. "Still, the two things do seem close together. Sometimes a bit of wind carries more than it should." Mrs. Stillingfleet's lips thinned. "Well, if you're suggesting my flour broke into the church and rang the bell, I'd like to see the charge sheet. Purbright smiled again, his tone unbothered. No charge sheets, Mrs. Stillingfleet, only curiosity. The town seems full of it today. He turned to go, pausing just before the door. If you recall anything more about the man's gloves, do send word to the station. Small details often have a way of turning up large. After he left, Mrs. Stillingfleet stood silently for a moment, pressing her palms against the counter as though steadying herself against invisible judgment. Marion glanced up.
You don't think he suspects you, do you?
Me? She said, almost laughing.
Good heavens, no.
What would I be doing near that church during a funeral?
I've got better things to rise. But she did not look entirely convinced by her own answer. By midday, the gossip had grown beyond her control.
People now spoke of a secret affair between the vicar and a mysterious widow, of money missing from the parish accounts, of a bell rope cut halfway through and spliced again with new cord. None of it was true, of course, but in Flaxborough, truth was rarely the preferred ingredient in a good story. At the post office, a cluster of townspeople debated the latest theory while pretending to queue. The clerk, Mrs. Thrip, newly widowed and therefore enjoying an unexpected authority, insisted that the bell's ringing was an omen, a sign her late husband had forgiven his debtors. The notion pleased her, and she repeated it to anyone within earshot, including Purbright, who arrived just as the conversation reached its most solemn tone. He offered condolences, listened without interruption, and only asked one question before leaving. Mrs. Thrip, did your husband ever mention keeping a key to the church tower? She blinked. Why would he have one? Grocers often have keys of one sort or another, Purbright said gently. People trust them to keep what matters safe. That evening, as dusk blurred the rooftops and the lamplighters made their slow way down the high street, Mrs. Stillingfleet closed her shop early. She told Marion she was unwell and needed rest, but when the girl left, she remained by the window, watching the shadowed tower opposite. Somewhere inside her, under the starch of propriety, a small tremor of unease took hold. She thought she saw movement near the vestry door, just a flicker of someone passing through the mist.
It could have been the vicar.
Or the sexton, or someone else entirely. She drew the curtain quickly, as though shutting out a thought best left unbaked. Across the square, in the soft yellow light of the police station, Purbright was still at his desk, turning his notebook to a fresh page. Beneath the word flower he added another witness. Then, after a moment's consideration, a third, nerves. He closed the book, folded his hands, and gazed thoughtfully toward the church spire, faintly visible through the rain. The bell remained silent that night, but in Flaxborough, silence was rarely the absence of noise. It was merely the space where the next sound waited to begin. The next morning dawned with a strained sort of politeness, the kind that made even the pigeons coo more quietly than usual. A soft mist hung over the churchyard, blurring the outlines of gravestones and lending the bell tower an air of innocent ignorance. Inside the vicarage, however, there was no mist, only the smell of slightly burnt toast, and the brittle sound of porcelain meeting. Porcelain, as the Reverend Lionel Tukes stirred his tea with unnecessary precision. Inspector Purbright arrived promptly at 9, escorted to the study by the vicar's housekeeper, who whispered, as though afraid the furniture might overhear, "He's been in there since dawn, sir, reading his sermon aloud to himself. Something about righteousness."
I wouldn't interrupt if I were you. Fortunately, Purbright murmured.
I'm paid precisely to interrupt righteousness. He entered the study to find Tukes seated behind his desk, gazing with affectionate detachment at a row of theological books. His expression was one of cultivated serenity, the sort a man achieves after years of rehearsing forgiveness for other people's failings. He rose politely. "Inspector, I wondered when you might come."
You've been very discreet.
"Admirably so. I try to avoid disturbing faith, Reverend, Purbright replied, though in this case the faith seems to have rung the bell for me. Tukes smiled with that peculiar mixture of condescension and charm often reserved for parishioners who misquote scripture. A most unfortunate business.
I can assure you no one in my parish would behave so crudely. Then the alternatives are interesting, said Purbright mildly.
Either an intruder, a ghost, or divine enthusiasm. The vicar chuckled, but the sound lacked warmth. I should hope heaven has better timing than that. Purbright noted the dryness of tone, the absence of curiosity. May I ask, Reverend, how many people have keys to the tower? Only myself and the sexton, though the late Mr. Thrip, God rest him, once borrowed one for flower arrangements. He returned it, of course. When?
Oh, years ago.
Quite irrelevant, I'm sure. Purbright inclined his head. The widow says otherwise. She mentioned his fondness for the church and his habit of keeping small things in safe keeping. Her phrase, not mine. The vicar's spoon paused mid-stir, then resumed its circular rhythm with deliberate calm. Mrs. Thrip is a woman of intense feelings. Bereavement often amplifies imagination. Indeed it does, said Purbright. Still, the imagination often starts from something solid. Tukes folded his hands on the table and regarded Purbright with mild rebuke. Inspector, I hope you're not suggesting that a recently deceased man arranged to toll his own bell. That would verge on the theatrical, Purbright smiled faintly. Oh, I'm not nearly so poetic. I'm merely interested in who might have wanted it rung for reasons the congregation wouldn't appreciate. The vicar's gaze flickered toward the window.
The people in this town do love their mysteries.
It gives them something to talk about when they've tired of one another. Quite so, Purbright agreed. And gossip, I find, is a most efficient form of confession. At that, Tukes gave a short, dry laugh. Then you'll have no shortage of pennants to distribute. Purbright stood. One more question. You mentioned the bell rope was locked away. Have you examined it since the incident? No, Pratt said he checked it. I trust his word. I'm sure you do. Still, words stretch as easily as ropes, Reverend. Perhaps I'll take a look myself. He left the vicarage with an impression that the man's calm was not born of faith, but of rehearsal. It was the calm of someone who had prepared himself for questions long before they were asked. Outside, the mist had thinned to a mild drizzle. Sergeant Malley waited by the gate, notebook in hand. How'd he seem, sir? Clean hands, Purbright said thoughtfully, and not the sort that ring bells. But I should like to know why he's so certain no one in his parish would misbehave. That kind of confidence usually means he knows exactly who would. They crossed to the church, the path slick with wet leaves. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wax and something less ecclesiastical, perhaps polish or perhaps nerves. The tower door yielded easily to Purbright's key. He climbed the narrow steps, counting 12 before the landing, 12 more to the platform, noting the footprints left by someone with smaller shoes than Pratt's. The bell rope hung neat and still. Near its base lay a small scrap of brown paper, folded twice. Purbright picked it up carefully. Inside, faint traces of grease and the unmistakable sweetness of dried fruit clung to the fibres. He smiled. Fruitcake.
Or something close enough to pass for it, Malley frowned.
A picnic in the tower, sir? More likely a peace offering.
Or payment. They descended again, closing the door behind them.
At the bottom, Purbright paused to study the memorial plaques along the nave. One caught his eye, in grateful memory of Amos Thrip, for services to parish maintenance. The words, carved in brass, seemed to shine more than they ought. Services, Purbright repeated softly. That's a flexible term, Sergeant. Some serve God, others serve convenience. Later that afternoon, Purbright stopped once more at the bakery. Mrs. Stillingfleet was arranging her window display with a martyr's patience. "Inspector," she greeted, "have you caught your bell ringer yet?" "Not yet, but we're getting warmer." He looked at the tray of fruit buns beside her. "Do you sell these to the church regularly?"
"Of course," she said.
"For the Sunday teas. The vicar insists on them." Claims they encourage fellowship. I call it sugar diplomacy, Purbright nodded.
How often are they delivered?
Every Saturday.
Amos Thrip used to collect them himself.
Always said he preferred to keep things proper. Why? Oh, no reason, Purbright replied pleasantly. Only that proper things often hide the improper ones quite neatly. He left her with that, and returned to the station, where dusk was already dimming the room's corners. He sat at his desk, flipping open his notebook. Flour, keys, fruit. The bell had rung for a reason, it always did. The living, Purbright thought, had far more cause to announce themselves than the dead, and somewhere between a vicar's composure and a baker's pride, someone had decided the sound of morning should carry a different message entirely. By the following afternoon, the town had done what it always did best. It had chosen a culprit. Logic in Flaxborough was a communal activity rarely interrupted by evidence. The man in question was Leonard Len Pask, one of the part-time bell ringers and a full-time consumer of anything sold by the pint. His name drifted from lips to teapots with the inevitability of jam sliding off toast. He was, everyone agreed, the sort, though few could specify precisely which sort that was. Sergeant Malley, who had once lost 2 shillings to Pask in a darts match, considered the theory sound enough to merit an arrest, or at least a conversation. "He's been seen near the church, sir," Malley reported that morning, his tone suggesting destiny rather than deduction.
Yesterday evening, round about dusk.
Had a look of mischief about him. "Len always has that look," said Purbright, glancing up from his paperwork. "It's the natural expression of a man who never quite remembers what day it is." He closed his notebook. "Still, fetch him in. There's no harm in a chat." Len Pask arrived half an hour later, hat in hand, shoes muddy, and face arranged in what he imagined to be an innocent expression. Unfortunately, it resembled mild constipation. "Morning, Inspector. Sergeant said you wanted a word." "I haven't done anything, mind." "I'm relieved to hear it," Purbright said pleasantly, "though I suppose that's for me to decide." "Sit down, Mr. Pask." Len sat, fidgeting with his cap. "This about that bell business? I told everyone I had nothing to do with it. I was over at the King's Arms Tuesday morning helping with the delivery."
Ask Mr. Clegg, he'll tell you. Purbright tilted his head.
"Tuesday morning, you say? That would be an unusual time for a delivery. Pubs are not known for their early thirst." "Well, maybe it was nearer 11, Len amended hastily. "Anyway, I was there all right." "I'd had a pint or 2 with my lunch." "You eat lunch before a funeral, then?" Len blinked.
"Funeral?" "Amos Thrip's, the same morning the bell rang." "Oh," he swallowed.
"Didn't know that was the same day." Purbright regarded him with gentle interest. "The whole town did, Mr. Pask. It's been discussed more vigorously than Parliament. Still, perhaps your memory will improve with a little help. Tell me, when you left the King's Arms, did you happen to pass the church?" Len hesitated. "Well, maybe I went that way, yes, but only 'cause the shortcut by the yard's less muddy. And did you see anyone there?"
"No one. Place was quiet as the grave. Pardon the saying." "Of course."
"And did you notice whether the tower door was open or shut?" "Shut, I think. Or maybe just not fully." "Hard to say with that fog." Purbright leaned back. "You've an excellent eye for detail when it suits you, Mr. Pask. Unfortunately, several witnesses saw you near the gate not long after the bell began to ring." Len's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish.
"I must have been mistaken. I wasn't there then. I was at home by noon. Ask me wife." "Your wife was at the funeral," Purbright said mildly. "She's mentioned as much." Len looked stricken. "Ah, well."
"Then maybe it was nearer 1 o'clock. Malley, standing by the filing cabinet, coughed meaningfully. "That'd be after the bell stopped, Len." Pask's eyes darted between them, desperate for an escape hatch. "Could be I've got my times mixed up, Inspector."
"I was feeling,
delicate that morning." "Bit of a headache, I imagine so," Purbright said.
Tell me, do you still have access to the church keys?" "Me? No.
I took 'em off me last Easter after that business with the bell rope." "What business was that?" "Oh, just a misunderstanding," Len mumbled. "I'd had a drop too much and thought it'd be nice to wring one out for St. George." Vicar didn't agree. "Understandable," Purbright said. "And yet, You happened to be in the area when the bell rang again without permission.
Curious symmetry, wouldn't you say?
Len gave a weak laugh. Coincidence, that's all.
Anyway, if you don't mind me saying, Inspector, you're barking up the wrong tree.
I might be a fool, but I'm no ghoul, Purbright smiled. No, Mr. Pask, not a ghoul. Merely a man with an unsteady sense of timing and a poor choice of shortcuts. He dismissed Pask after another few polite questions. When the door closed, Mally exhaled. He's lying through his teeth, sir. You could smell the guilt on him. Perhaps, said Purbright. Or perhaps he's simply trying to remember what story sounds least foolish. Guilt and confusion often wear the same suit. They left the station together and walked toward the church. The drizzle had turned to a steady rain, soaking the slate rooftops and dimming the shop fronts. Across the street, Mrs. Stillingfleet was standing in her doorway again, arms folded, watching everything with the expression of a woman who had already reached a verdict. Inside the nave, the air was chill. Purbright studied the tower rope again, noting a faint discoloration just above the knot, something that looked suspiciously like grease, and beneath it, a trace of flour dust. Our Mr. Pask doesn't strike me as the baking type, he said quietly. Mally looked puzzled. And why the flour? That's what I'd like to know, Purbright replied. Flour at the gate, on the rope and in the air of half the stories I've heard. Someone's been needing their alibi. That evening, word spread that Pask had been questioned, and by supper time the town's conscience was at rest. The general view was that the police had done their duty, that decency had been restored, and that Len Pask's name would soon reappear in the local paper under the heading Drunk and Disorderly, a fate both familiar and comfortable. But Purbright did not share their satisfaction. Sitting at his desk, pen tapping the edge of his notebook, he reviewed what he had gathered. Flour, keys, fruit, alibi. Each fit neatly with the others, yet none explained why a bell had rung for a man already buried, nor who had wanted it to sound that way. He poured himself a cup of tepid tea, staring into the faintly rippling surface. The town, he thought, had accepted the simplest story, but simplicity was often camouflage for something far messier. Somewhere beneath the rain and routine, someone had planned a small deceit, and done so with the care of a person used to handling delicate things, perhaps even pastry. As the station clock chimed the quarter hour, Purbright smiled faintly to himself.
Terrible alibi, Len, he murmured.
But a convenient one for someone else entirely. The rain persisted through the night, washing the town's pavements clean of footprints, but not of suspicion. By morning, a thin sunlight had returned, pale and apologetic, revealing puddles that reflected the tower of St. Swithin's like a guilty conscience. Inspector Purbright, coat collar turned up against the chill, walked the short distance from the station to the churchyard with a thoughtful slowness. The day's post had brought him nothing but the usual: a complaint about bicycles left near the library steps, a letter from the mayor regarding public confidence, and a catalogue of constabulary supplies, none of which included common sense, which he often felt in short supply. He had decided to look again at the tower, not because he expected revelation, but because details, like certain parishioners, revealed their true nature only after being observed repeatedly. Pratt the sexton was already there, crouched beside the door with a mop and a sigh. "Morning, Inspector. Come to bless the damp, have you?" "Something of the kind," Purbright replied.
Any discoveries overnight? Only that I'm getting too old to scrub stone, Pratt muttered.
"The vicar says we must present a clean face to the Lord. I told him the Lord's seen worse than pigeon droppings." Purbright smiled faintly and stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled of rope, wax, and something faintly chemical. Yeast, perhaps, though that seemed an odd scent for a bell tower. He ascended the steps slowly, pausing halfway up, when something caught the light on the ledge. A small, brownish object, half hidden by dust. He picked it up. A glove, one of those cheap, practical pairs sold in the hardware shop on Market Street. The right hand only, worn smooth at the fingers and faintly marked with flour along the palm. Purbright held it thoughtfully, turning it over as though it might confess something if given time. When he reached the platform, the air grew cooler. He noticed a paper packet tucked behind a timber beam, flattened but intact. The faded print read, "Yeast, strong active, for home baking." He slit it open gently. Inside, a few granules clung to the paper, damp but unmistakable. He descended with both items and found Pratt still mopping.
"Tell me," Purbright asked, "and does the vicar bake?"
Pratt straightened, puzzled. "Bake? Not unless you count sermons." "Why, just curiosity." "And Mrs. Stillingfleet, she supplies bread for the church teas, yes?"
"Oh, aye, every week."
"The vicar won't have anyone else's, says hers rises properly." Purbright nodded. "Quite." He left the church and walked toward the high street, stopping outside the bakery. Through the window, Mrs. Stillingfleet was arranging loaves in the display, her movements brisk and deliberate, as though fending off accusation through neatness. He entered quietly, hat in hand. "Inspector?" she greeted without turning. "If you've come for gossip, I'm sold out. But I can offer scones." "Tempting," Purbright said, "though I came for something less edible. Tell me, Mrs. Stillingfleet, do you sell these gloves?" He produced the single glove from his pocket. She glanced at it briefly, her composure tightening. "Those? No, the ironmonger sells them, I believe. For gardeners and such." "Indeed."
"Odd then to find one in the church tower with traces of flour." She froze, tray in hand.
"Flour gets everywhere in this town, Inspector. You'll find it in the post office if you look hard enough." "I dare say," he said mildly.
"And yeast too?"
That made her pause.
"Yeast?"
He held out the paper packet, found near the same spot. Strange thing to take up a tower, unless one intends to bake between tolls. Her eyes flickered toward the door, then back to him. "You're implying something, Inspector?"
"I hope you'll be clear enough to say it." "Not implying," he said.
"Just noting that these items seem rather domestic for a place of worship, almost as though someone carried them there from habit rather than plan." She drew a breath, her chin lifting. "I've nothing to do with any of that business, and I'll thank you not to suggest otherwise." "I'm not suggesting, Mrs. Stillingfleet. I'm only asking." He smiled faintly. "You see, whoever rang that bell wasn't trying to make noise for mischief's sake. It was cover, something to draw eyes away while a smaller act took place elsewhere. Perhaps near the vestry. Perhaps involving something valuable." She stared at him, the colour slowly leaving her cheeks.
"You think someone stole from the church?" "I think someone used the church," he said softly.
"And I think that person had flour on their hands long before the bell rope ever felt it." He left her there, flustered and speechless, and walked out into the thin sunlight. Across the street, the vicar emerged from his gate, adjusting his collar with mechanical care. Their eyes met briefly. Purbright tipped his hat. Tukey's inclined his head, the motion too smooth, too practiced. Later, back at the station, Purbright placed the glove and packet side by side on his desk.
Mally entered, shaking off his raincoat.
"Odd pair of clues, sir." "Odd, yes," Purbright said, "but not unrelated. Gloves to keep the hands clean, yeast to make things rise. One conceals, the other expands."
"A moral symmetry, wouldn't you say?" Mally blinked.
"If you say so, sir." Purbright smiled slightly. "The question, Sergeant, is what, besides dough, was being made to rise?" Outside, the last of the puddles reflected the tower in perfect miniature, its bell silent and still. But in Flaxborough, silence was rarely peace. It was only the moment when people stopped talking long enough to listen for the next rumour. And Purbright, turning the flour-stained glove over once more,
had begun to suspect that what the bell had covered was not just a theft, but a transaction.
Conducted quietly under the sound of mourning. It was the following morning that Inspector Purbright began to notice the faintest tremor of change in the air, something beneath the town's
usual hum of self-importance.
People were quieter, more deliberate. The gossip, though far from gone, had taken on a confidential tone, like a hymn sung one octave lower. The church bell no longer dominated conversation. Instead, whispers had begun to circle about the late Mr. Thrip's widow and a supposed arrangement she was said to have made in confidence with the council clerk. Mrs. Thrip, stout and perpetually scented with lavender, had been seen twice in the High Street the previous day, both times emerging from the council offices with a look that could only be described as satisfaction disguised as sorrow. By breakfast time, the theory was general. She had come into some advantage from her husband's death, though how or why no one could quite say. Purbright, who preferred facts to feelings, arranged to visit her that afternoon. When he arrived at the small house behind the post office, Mrs. Thrip was sitting at her kitchen table, folding letters she had clearly already read several times. "Inspector," she said with that peculiar blend of pride and self-pity characteristic of the newly bereaved, "you'll forgive the clutter. I've had callers all morning, mostly people who never called when Amos was alive." "I'm sure grief brings out the better angels in people," Purbright said mildly, taking the chair she indicated.
"You've had some dealings with the council lately?"
Her eyes brightened, then narrowed. "Oh, only a little business about Amos's accounts. He did some voluntary work for them, you know."
"Maintenance, odd jobs?"
"It seems they owed him a small sum." "Ah, and have they paid?"
"Yes, yesterday, as it happens. Mr. Pyle from the clerk's office came himself."
"Very polite, though I thought it unusual he'd bother."
"Normally they just send a cheque through the post." Purbright made a note.
"How much was owed, if I may ask?" £30, she said proudly. "Quite a lot, I thought." "He said it was for unpaid work on the church roof."
"I hadn't known Amos had done any, but then men don't tell their wives everything, do they?"
"Rarely the things that matter," said Purbright. "And did Mr. Pyle say where the money came from, council funds or church donations?" "I didn't ask."
I was too grateful to think.
"Though he did say something about wanting the matter settled before questions arose." "I suppose that was his way of being considerate," Purbright smiled faintly. "Indeed, he sounds a man of delicate phrasing." When he left her house, the light had already shifted toward afternoon, a low amber that made the shop windows glow like warm treacle. Purbright walked the few streets to the council offices, where the air always smelled of carbon paper and self-importance. Mr. Pyle was found at his desk, head bent over a ledger of formidable thickness. "Inspector Purbright," he said with an oily affability, "I heard you've been asking questions about that unfortunate affair at the church. Dreadful business. I do hope you're getting somewhere." "I'm getting," Purbright said evenly, "to the matter of a payment. £30 to Mrs. Thrip. You authorized it, I believe?" Pyle's smile flickered.
"Ah, yes, a small adjustment."
"Routine housekeeping, really? We'd overlooked some minor reimbursements owed to the late Mr. Thrip. No reason to trouble the committee with it." "I see. And the funds came from where?" "General maintenance account."
"Nothing irregular?" "Nothing," Purbright repeated, "except the timing. A funeral one day, settlement the next."
"You move efficiently, Mr. Pyle, almost preemptively." Pyle's pen froze mid-tap. "I like to keep things tidy, Inspector."
"Is what I'm paid for, of course." Purbright's eyes rested briefly on a small smudge of white on the man's cuff. "Tell me, do you bake, Mr. Pyle?"
The clerk blinked. "Bake? Or perhaps frequent those who do."
"There's flour on your sleeve." "Oh, yes, yes. Picked it up at Mrs. Stillingfleet's, I expect."
"She stopped me this morning to talk about her shop sign. Wanted to know if she could put it closer to the pavement."
"Regulations, you see." Purbright's voice remained mild.
"Naturally."
"And did she give you anything for your trouble?"
"A bun," he said after a pause.
"Currant?"
"She insisted." "I imagine she did," Purbright murmured. "Very kind of her." He left the clerk to his papers and stepped out into the square, where the town clock struck 5 with the sluggish dignity of an old man clearing his throat. Across the way the church door stood open at last, the bell tower silent above. Inside, a boy's voice echoed faintly, clear, uncertain, singing scales. Purbright followed the sound and found young Edwin Cobb, one of the choir boys, perched on a pew, polishing hymn books with a rag too large for his hands. He looked up guiltily as Purbright entered. "Good evening, lad."
Practicing?
"Just tidying, sir. Mr. Pratt said to make myself useful. And you do, I'm sure. Tell me, were you here on Tuesday morning when the bell rang?" The boy nodded. "I was in the yard, sir. I was supposed to help the sexton carry lilies. And did you see anyone go into the tower?" He hesitated, glancing toward the vestry. "Maybe. I thought I saw the vicar, but he didn't look dressed for service."
He had no collar on, just his coat. And was he alone? I think so, sir.
But then someone else came after, a man with a parcel. He went round the back. "What sort of parcel?" The boy frowned, searching memory. "Small, like a packet of sugar. He gave it to the vicar, I think. Then the bell rang, and I ran off because everyone shouted. Purbright thanked him, told him he'd done well, and left him polishing again, his hymn book now shining with unnecessary zeal. Outside, dusk had settled over the town, and the lamplighters were beginning their steady rounds. As Purbright crossed the square toward the station, he felt the faintest stir of satisfaction. The pieces, though small and untidy, were starting to form the outline of a picture. A baker, a vicar, a council clerk, and a widow, each tied to the church, each dabbling, in their own way, in Propriety's little theatre, back in his office. He opened his notebook once more and wrote, "Payment, parcel, choirboy." Then, after a pause, he added a fourth word, performance. The bell, he reflected, might have been the loudest sound that day, but it was only the accompaniment. The real music had been the rustle of paper, the shuffle of money, and the quiet rhythm of secrets rehearsed until they sounded innocent. The morning after Purbright's conversation with the choirboy began with a stillness that felt more deliberate than natural. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for some invisible cue to resume its chatter. The church bell, mute since its scandalous outburst, loomed above the square like a chastised child forbidden to speak. Yet even silence in Flaxborough had a way of carrying news. By 10 o'clock, Purbright was reading his morning reports when Sergeant Malley entered, clutching a damp envelope. "From the postman, sir," he said. "Odd business. Said it was found in the churchyard wall box just after dawn."
No stamp, no address, just your name. Purbright took it, examining the spidery handwriting.
Inside was a single sheet folded twice. The message was brief, written in an uncertain hand. "If you want the truth, ask who the bell was meant for. But don't listen for it, it won't ring again." He reread it once, then again aloud. Curious. The author warns of silence as if it were a threat. "Anonymous, sir," Malley offered helpfully. "Could be another prank." "Perhaps," said Purbright. "But pranks rarely require ink." He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the sun was climbing weakly through thin clouds, and the square had resumed its slow rhythm. Shop shutters lifted and carts rattled over cobblestones. Life went on, yet there was an undercurrent of unease, as though the town had grown wary of its own reflections. By midday, Purbright's footsteps led him once more to the church. He had learned long ago that crimes in quiet towns were rarely isolated events. They were habits, not happenings. Pratt was nowhere to be seen, so Purbright entered alone, the echo of his shoes merging with the distant hum of organ practice from the chancel. The air felt different, lighter somehow, though still faintly scented with polish and damp stone. As he approached the vestry, he noticed something new. A small wooden box resting beside the prayer stand. It was the collection box, normally chained near the entrance, now moved and empty. Its lock had been forced cleanly open. Purbright bent to examine it and saw faint dust on the lid. Yeast again, unmistakably. He straightened slowly, considering. Someone had moved the box recently, then wiped it down. Perhaps during the funeral, perhaps after. He noted the faint mark on the floor where the box had sat and followed the trail. A smear leading toward the side door, the one that opened onto the vicarage garden. The handle bore no damage, but it turned easily. Outside, the garden lay in neat disarray, trimmed hedges, damp grass, a few flower pots knocked over. On the path lay another envelope, smaller than the first, its edges curled by dew. He opened it carefully.
Inside, a single pressed violet. No words, no signature. When he returned to the station, Mally looked up expectantly.
"Progress, sir?" "Evidence of sentiment, Sergeant."
Never underestimate it.
"People hide money for greed, but they hide violets for shame," Mally frowned. "You think it's connected?"
Everything in Flaxborough is connected, Purbright said.
Usually by tea, gossip, or guilt. This time, perhaps all three. That evening, as the lamps began to glow and the mist rolled back over the rooftops, the postman stopped by the station again. "Oddest thing, Inspector," he said, lowering his voice. "I could have sworn I heard the bell this afternoon, just one faint toll when I passed the church. Thought I imagined it, but the sound sort of lingered." "Like when you strike a glass," Purbright studied him. "You're certain?" "Well, not certain, sir."
I was near the bakery then. Maybe it was her trays clinking. Maybe, said Purbright, though his eyes remained thoughtful.
"Did anyone else hear it?"
I can't say.
But the vicar came out a moment later, looked up at the tower, then went straight back inside. When the man had gone, Purbright sat for a long moment, listening to the clock tick in the quiet office. The image of the vicar staring up at his own bell tower hung in his mind, precise as a photograph.
Another ring, he murmured.
This time without sound. At 8, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, he returned to the church. The doors were locked, as expected, but the vestry window glowed faintly. He moved closer. Inside, the Reverend Tukes sat alone at his desk, head bowed over a sheet of paper. On the table beside him lay a small wooden mallet, the sort used to strike tuning forks, and beside it a tiny brass bell, no larger than a teacup. Tukes lifted the mallet and struck the bell once. It made no sound Purbright could hear, though he saw the faint quiver in the air that followed. The vicar smiled faintly to himself, folded the paper, and placed it in an envelope, the same pale kind that had found its way to Purbright that morning. Then, with almost ceremonial care, he set the violet atop it. Purbright stepped back into shadow, his mind assembling the pieces not yet shaped into logic. A bell that rang for the living. A widow newly paid, a clerk too helpful, a baker too defensive, and now a vicar who struck silence as though it were a note only he could hear. By the time he returned to the station, the streets were empty. Mally had gone home and the lamps flickered low. Purbright sat at his desk, drew out his notebook, and added 3 new words beneath the others: letter, violet, soundless, then, after a pause, a 4th, signal. He closed the book and leaned back, eyes half closed as the faintest echo of a bell, imagined or not, seemed to drift through the night air. It was not a sound exactly, but a memory of one, as if the tower itself were whispering something too soft for ordinary ears. Somewhere beyond the dark, he thought, someone had just struck the next note in a melody no one else yet recognized, and when it was finished, Flaxborough would hear far more than a bell. Inspector Purbright had long believed that crime in a small town was less about desperation and more about proportion. In Flaxborough, where lives were measured in inches of reputation and ounces of courtesy, people rarely stole out of need. They did it more often because something somewhere had seemed unfair. That thought lingered with him the next morning as he sat at his desk, staring at the pale winter light slanting across the blotter. The violet from the envelope lay pressed between 2 sheets of foolscap, its scent faint but persistent, like a secret that refused to fade. He considered what the vicar had done the previous night. There had been no crime in it, not technically, but something deeply ritualistic, private, and uneasy. That small, soundless bell, that careful folding of the paper, those violets. It was theatre, yes, but with meaning too subtle for mere sentimentality. If Tukes had been paying tribute to the dead, It was not to Amos Thrip. It was to whatever had died with him. The connection between faith and finance had always interested Purbright. Religion, after all, was the one trade in Flaxborough where profit wore a halo. He thought again of Mrs. Thrip's unexpected windfall. £30, passed quietly under the banner of maintenance. A convenient phrase, one that could conceal anything from an unpaid invoice to a bribe. Mr. Pyle had been eager to close the account, too eager. The vicar, meanwhile, had maintained his unflappable calm, as though long accustomed to watching moral corners swept clean. He rose, stretched, and crossed to the window. Outside, the church tower was barely visible through the pale mist, its outline softened by distance. A bell that rang for the living, the note had said. Not for death, then, but for debt, or perhaps for deliverance. Something owed had been repaid, and not entirely in money. Purbright lit his pipe, an indulgence the cleaner had long since surrendered protesting, and sat again. He let the smoke drift upward, tracing thoughts with it. He thought of Mrs. Stillingfleet's flower-streaked gloves, the glove itself found in the tower, the yeast packet hidden like a signature. He thought of the vicar's calm, the clerk's fluster, the widow's relief, and the boy's innocent testimony, all separate, yet circling one another like small planets tugged by an unseen sun. There was a knock on the door. Sergeant Malley entered, his usual blend of earnestness and confusion. "Morning, sir." The accounts came through from the council office. "You asked for anything to do with St. Swithin's." He placed a folder on the desk. "Looks dull enough to cure insomnia." "Perfect," Purbright said, taking it. "That's where truth tends to hide." He leafed through the papers slowly, rows of tidy figures, stamps of approval, receipts for cleaning and minor repairs. And there, midway through, a curious entry, Restoration Fund, miscellaneous contributions, 30 paid to A. Thrip, services rendered. Dated 2 months before the man's death, Purbright smiled slightly. "Services rendered indeed," he tapped the page. "Did we ever find out what work Thrip actually did on the church roof?" Malley shook his head. "Pratt says no one's touched that roof in years. Leaks like anything when it rains." "Then our late grocer seems to have been compensated for keeping things dry that were already dripping." "A tidy miracle," Malley frowned. "You think it was embezzlement?" Purbright looked out the window again. "I think it was reverence, of a very local kind. Money moves in curious ways when people fear scandal. And our Reverend Tukes, I suspect, has been shepherding more than souls." The sergeant scratched his head.
You think he took the money? Not for himself, necessarily.
He might simply have redirected it. A pious redistribution, if you like. Malley's eyes brightened with premature comprehension.
To the widow?
Possibly. Or to whoever needed to keep her quiet. Perhaps she knew something about Amos's dealings that would have proved inconvenient for the living. £30 is a small price for discretion, particularly in a town where silence can be bought cheaper than bread. Malley blinked. "Still ringing a church bell to cover it up, that's madness." Purbright's voice softened.
Not madness, symbolism. The bell tolls to mark the end of something, a life, a debt, a secret.
Whoever rang it wanted to make sure no one noticed what else was ending, while the town's attention was fixed on sorrow. He closed the folder, the gesture quiet but final.
Tell Pratt I'd like to see him this afternoon.
"And see if you can find out whether Mr. Pyle's been to the church again since Tuesday. Discreetly, Sergeant." After Malley left, Purbright remained seated for a long moment. The pipe had gone out, leaving a thin curl of smoke that dissipated like an afterthought. He felt, not for the first time, a twinge of melancholy about his profession. Most people thought crime revealed evil. In truth, it often revealed the shape of ordinary decency stretched too far. The baker protecting her pride, the clerk protecting his post, the vicar protecting the sanctity of a lie told for the sake of calm. Reverence and revenue, two words that in Flaxborough were rarely kept apart. Each required maintenance, each demanded faith, and both, he thought, had an unpleasant tendency to ring false when struck too hard. Outside, The mist had begun to lift. From his window, Purbright could just make out Mrs. Stillingfleet sweeping her doorstep with the air of a woman determined to sweep guilt away with the crumbs. Across the square, the vicar's figure appeared briefly in the churchyard, stooping to pick up something unseen before vanishing inside. Purbright watched them both until they disappeared from sight, then opened his notebook once more. Beneath his earlier entries, he wrote 3 new words in the same neat hand: debt, faith, noise. He stared at them for a long time, then underlined only one, faith, because, he thought, faith was always the last to confess. The next day broke clear and dry, a rare concession from the weather, and Flaxborough seemed determined to treat it as a sign that all recent unpleasantness had been neatly packed away. The church bell remained decorously silent, and the bakery's morning trade bustled with the forced cheer of people trying to talk about anything but what had happened. Yet Purbright, seated in his office with a cup of tea that had long gone tepid, knew better than to mistake quiet for calm. Quiet, in towns like this, was simply the sound of guilt learning its lines. He had spent the morning reviewing the facts once more: the letter with its cryptic warning, the violet, the flower, the yeast, the glove, the payment to the widow, and the vicar's oddly composed conscience. And now the final, most inconvenient piece, the discovery that Amos Thripp's funeral had cost considerably more than the parish register recorded. The undertaker's bill had been reduced, discreetly, by exactly £30. Someone had already made restitution. Purbright stirred his cold tea and smiled to himself. "Every act of charity," he murmured, "hides a small arithmetic." Sergeant Malley appeared at the door, holding his hat like a nervous schoolboy. "Sir, I made those inquiries about Pyle you asked for. He was seen near the vicarage again last night, around 8. The grocer's lad swears he watched him hand a letter through the gate. Hand or receive? Couldn't say. Said the light was poor, but he's sure it was Pyle." Purbright nodded.
"Thank you, Malley."
"That's just enough to spoil someone's afternoon." He rose, stretched slightly, and reached for his coat. "Fetch the vicar. Tell him I'll call at his house for tea. I expect he'll find that civilized enough." The vicarage, when Purbright arrived, was a portrait of orderly anxiety. The drawing-room was heavy with the scent of polished oak and last week's flowers. Reverend Tukes greeted him with a composure so carefully arranged it might have been ironed. "Inspector, this is a surprise, but not, I trust, an unwelcome one." "Not at all," Purbright said amiably, accepting the chair nearest the fire. "I find a cup of tea loosens truth faster than interrogation ever could." The vicar smiled thinly. "You sound like a philosopher." "I try to sound harmless," Purbright replied. "It helps." He let the silence settle before continuing. "You've been busy these past few evenings, I gather." Tukes paused in pouring the tea, just long enough for the pause to register. "Clergyman's work never ends, Inspector. Pastoral visits, correspondence, the occasional prayer."
"Why do you ask?"
"I was told you had a visitor last night. Mr. Pyle from the council office. An industrious man." The vicar's expression did not change, but his hand hovered briefly above the sugar bowl.
"Ah, yes, he did call."
"A small matter of receipts, parish business. Hardly worth the attention of the law." "Oh, I don't doubt it," Purbright said mildly. "But tell me, Reverend, was it also parish business when he paid £30 to Mrs. Thripp the morning after her husband's funeral?" The teacup rattled faintly as it met the saucer. "You seem remarkably well informed." "It's my trade," Purbright said. "Though what interests me isn't the payment itself. It's the motive. The timing, you see, was so convenient. The bell rang, the town panicked, and amid all the noise a tidy little debt was settled. One might almost call it providential." Tukes's lips tightened.
"I hardly see the connection." "Nor did most people," Purbright replied softly.
That was the beauty of it. While everyone stared at the tower, someone took advantage of distraction to deliver more earthly blessings. You knew Amos Thripp handled small sums for the church, collections, donations, that sort of thing. But you also knew he had been careless. A few shillings misplaced, a ledger column adjusted. Not theft, perhaps, but temptation unresisted. When he died, that secret might have died with him, unless someone else had reason to fear discovery. The vicar rose, turning toward the window. "You are suggesting," he said carefully, "that I conspired to conceal embezzlement?" Purbright took a slow sip of tea. "Not exactly. I'm suggesting you decided that scandal would do more harm to the parish than a quiet correction. You arranged to repay the missing money through a third party, Mr. Pyle, who already owed you a favour or two, and Mrs. Thrip, who preferred gratitude to inquiry. It was, if you'll forgive the term, a holy laundering." Tukes turned, his calm restored by effort.
"That's a very imaginative tale, Inspector." "It is," Purbright agreed.
"But there's one part I still don't quite understand." He leaned forward slightly. "Why the bell?" For the first time the vicar hesitated. His composure cracked, just enough for something human to show beneath. "Because," he said finally, "it needed to be heard. Repentance means nothing if it goes unheard." Purbright regarded him quietly. "So you arranged for the bell to ring during the funeral so that your conscience might have an audience?"
"I arranged nothing," Tukes said sharply.
"I only told someone that the bell ought to toll once more before the service ended."
"A symbolic gesture. I couldn't have known it would be done so crudely. Someone."
He hesitated. "Mrs. Stillingfleet, she was in the vestry that morning, delivering bread for the wake. I merely remarked upon the tradition of the passing bell. She took it, perhaps, too literally." Purbright said nothing for a moment. Then he set down his cup.
"And you said nothing when the town began to talk." "I thought silence the kinder course," the vicar murmured.
"For her? For everyone," Purbright rose. "Kindness," he said gently, "is often the last refuge of guilt. Thank you for the tea, Reverend. You've been most illuminating." Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted across the square, turning the church windows into amber sheets of light. Purbright paused at the gate, watching as Mrs. Stillingfleet herself crossed toward the vicarage door, carrying a small covered basket. She looked up, saw him, and faltered for half a step before continuing on. He did not stop her. He only smiled faintly and murmured, "Another confession, perhaps." This time, without bells, he returned to the station as the clock struck 6. On his desk, the pressed violet still lay between its pages, a fragile reminder of quiet repentance. Purbright opened his notebook and wrote a single line beneath his previous entries. "One question, asked politely, is worth a sermon, answered late." He closed the book with a soft thud. The day's work, like the town itself, was far from finished, but for the first time he felt the faint sense of something turning, the moment before truth begins to speak. The vestry was colder than usual that afternoon, its chill preserved by the thick stone walls that had heard far too many confessions disguised as conversations. A faint smell of polish, candle grease, and damp hymnals clung to the air, familiar, pious, and faintly hypocritical. Inspector Purbright stood by the table, his hat resting beside the open ledger, while the Reverend Tukes, Mrs. Stillingfleet, and Mr. Pyle arranged themselves uneasily around him. Sergeant Malley hovered by the door, a discreet witness to whatever civility was about to unravel. Purbright spoke first, his tone mild but carrying easily in the quiet space. "I thought it best to meet here, where the matter began, and with any luck, where it might end. We've all been very industrious these past few days."
Though not always in the same direction. Mrs. Stillingfleet looked indignant,
though her eyes betrayed the faint tremor of someone waiting for the first stone to be thrown.
"I've nothing to be ashamed of, Inspector. I only did what the Reverend suggested." Tukes turned sharply.
"Suggested," Mrs. Stillingfleet, not instructed. "I remarked on the beauty of tradition, that the bell should toll once more in memory."
"I did not expect you to act upon it without guidance," she bristled.
"Well, someone had to."
"It seemed right."
Poor Amos deserved to be remembered properly. "Indeed he did," Purbright said quietly. Though it seems what was remembered most vividly was not Amos, but the noise. And that noise, I think, was the point. Pyle cleared his throat, his voice thin and papery. If I might say, Inspector, this whole business has been blown entirely out of proportion. A little misunderstanding between well-intentioned people. Purbright regarded him gently, as one might a man standing too close to a cliff.
Ah, Mr. Pyle, you've said those words before, I think.
A little misunderstanding. Such a fine phrase for smoothing out the corners of dishonesty. The clerk's mouth twitched, but he stayed silent. Purbright opened the church ledger and turned it toward them. Here, he said, tapping the page, we have the parish accounts. Neatly written, perfectly respectable. And here, a curious entry, Restoration Fund, miscellaneous contributions, $30 paid to A. Thrip, services rendered. Only as we've established, no such services were rendered. What Mr. Thrip received was not wages, but hush money, disguised as reimbursement. Tukes drew a slow breath. You're presuming far too much, Inspector. Am I? Purbright lifted his eyes. Mr. Thrip discovered something, some irregularity in how the fund was being managed. He wasn't clever enough to exploit it discreetly, but he was canny enough to hint that he might. You, Reverend, saw the risk to your parish's reputation. You asked Mr. Pyle to tidy it up. A small payment, perhaps with promises attached. That would have been the end of it had Mr. Thrip not died so inconveniently soon. Pyle swallowed audibly. It was the vicar's decision.
I only did as requested, Mrs. Stillingfleet gasped softly, one hand flying to her chest. You mean he really did pay him off?
Purbright's tone remained even.
Oh, yes.
But there's a second matter, the replacement of the money. Someone after Thrip's death made sure the missing sum reappeared in the account. It was returned quietly through the undertaker, whose invoice was adjusted. That transaction came from your bakery, Mrs. Stillingfleet, she blinked. My bakery, he nodded. £30, deposited through the vicar's fund under the name of your business. You were persuaded, or perhaps volunteered, to disguise the repayment as a charitable gift. Her voice faltered. He said it was for the church roof. Tukes's calm faltered at last. It was for the roof, eventually. The parish needed the appearance of order, not the chaos of accusation. Surely, Inspector, you can appreciate the necessity of discretion. I can appreciate motive, Purbright said, but I've yet to see one that absolves deceit. There was a silence, broken only by the creak of the vestry door, as the wind nudged it slightly. Outside, faintly, the sound of children's voices drifted from the churchyard. Innocent noise, sharp and brief, reminding them all of what honesty sounded like. Purbright turned back to the vicar. You were seen last night, Reverend, striking a small brass bell at your desk. Why? Tukes hesitated, then sighed. It was symbolic. The soundless bell is used in contemplation, an object of focus. I had it from a retreat years ago, a reminder that repentance is silent work. Yet you left letters for me, Purbright said softly. Letters that spoke of silence as though it were both threat and confession. The first warned me not to listen for the truth. The second contained a violet, the same kind found near the choir rail, where Mrs. Stillingfleet dropped them during the funeral. You've both been engaged in confession in your own ways. Only Mr. Pyle, it seems, preferred arithmetic to absolution. Pyle's composure collapsed entirely.
It was meant to protect the church,
he burst out. Thrip was blackmailing us. Said he'd tell the papers unless we compensated him. The vicar wanted it handled quietly. He feared scandal. I simply facilitated the repayment. And the second payment? Purbright asked. Pyle hesitated.
That was my idea.
I asked Mrs. Stillingfleet to contribute. She owed a small sum in unpaid rent for the church hall teas. It seemed a convenient way to clear her account. So, Purbright said, his tone neither cruel nor kind, a baker's debt erased a dead man's blackmail, underwritten by a clergyman's conscience.
A tidy theology of convenience. No one spoke.
The vicar's hands were clasped tightly before him. Mrs. Stillingfleet's gaze had sunk to the floor. Only Pyle looked anywhere near defiant, though it was the defiance of a man who had already realized resistance was merely a posture. Purbright closed the ledger and straightened his hat. "There'll be no charges," he said finally. "The law, you see, rarely troubles itself with sins that masquerade as civic duty, but the truth, once heard, tends to echo longer than the bell that rang for the living. I suggest you each prepare for that sound." He turned toward the door. Behind him, the vicar whispered something that might have been gratitude or prayer. Purbright did not pause to find out. Outside, the evening had begun to darken. The air was cold but clean, and the tower loomed above, its bell still and pale against the fading sky. Purbright looked up at it for a long moment, then murmured almost to himself, "Reverence and revenue both restored, and yet neither quite redeemed." He walked away down the cobbled path, the last echo of his footsteps fading beneath the silent weight of St. Swithin's unringing bell. Sunday arrived with deceptive serenity. The sky was a mild blue, and the wind smelled faintly of cut grass and chimney smoke, an English sort of peace, polite and temporary. The townspeople of Flaxborough filed into St. Swithin's with a sense of restored order, as if the week's oddities had been neatly folded and put away. The bell did not ring, though a few of the older parishioners glanced upward as they passed beneath the tower, just to make sure it hadn't changed its mind. Inside, the service began as usual. Reverend Tukes's voice carried evenly through the nave, measured and warm, though those who listened closely might have noticed a thinness beneath the tone, like fabric stretched one wear too many. He preached of renewal of peace after disturbance, of how forgiveness was not a public act, but a quiet decision one must make in the still corners of the soul. Purbright, seated toward the back, allowed himself a faint smile. It was, he thought, a fitting sermon for a man who had been granted both mercy and discomfort in equal measure. Afterward, the congregation moved toward the doors in a rustle of coats and polite greetings. Mrs. Stillingfleet stood near the font, her usual brightness dimmed to something humbler. When Purbright passed, she offered a tight nod and murmured, "A lovely service, Inspector. Calming?" "Quite," he said, though sometimes calm is simply what's left when all the noise has confessed itself. She blinked, uncertain whether he was admonishing or agreeing, and said nothing more. The vicar greeted him at the door, his smile impeccable but his eyes evasive.
"I trust all matters are
"Concluded?" "Almost," Purbright said. "Just one small thing. I wonder, Reverend, have you thought about who the bell really rang for?" The vicar hesitated, his hands tightening on the prayer book. "For the town, perhaps. For its conscience, possibly," said Purbright. "Or perhaps for those still pretending to have one." He tipped his hat and walked out into the bright noon. The square was quieter than it should have been. The gossip that usually bloomed after a service had wilted into subdued conversation. The bakery was open, but no queue had formed. Mrs. Stillingfleet, it seemed, had chosen not to put her famous buns on display that day. Instead, a small handwritten sign stood in the window, "Closed early, day of rest." It was the first time in years that she had rested on a Sunday. At the police station, Purbright found Sergeant Malley wrestling with the typewriter, which was losing the battle. "Morning, sir. Uneventful day, I'm glad to say." "That's what people always believe just before events resume," Purbright said, hanging his coat. "Keep believing it as long as you can." He sat at his desk, drew the violet from his notebook, now brittle and almost scentless, and laid it beside the final page of his notes. The story, such as it was, had ended neatly enough for paperwork. No arrests, no scandal, no official wrongdoing. And yet, as always in Flaxborough, neatness was not the same as justice. The living had tidied up after the dead, and the town had chosen silence over introspection. He thought of Amos Thrip, An ordinary man who had stumbled over other people's small arrangements and paid for it with convenience rather than malice. He thought of Tukes, whose calm now seemed less like faith and more like fatigue. He thought of Mrs. Stillingfleet, sweeping flour from her counter with hands that had, for a moment, touched deceit, and of Pyle, the clerk who would keep balancing his books though some figures could never quite be reconciled. Purbright leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window. The bell tower rose beyond, pale against the clear sky, its great silent shape both sentinel and warning. The town would go on as it always did, priding itself on manners, overlooking its blemishes, pretending the air was clearer than it was. But he knew that every so often someone would glance toward the church and wonder, very quietly, what it had cost to buy back its peace. He heard footsteps in the corridor and the faint jingle of Mally's keys.
"Anything else today, sir?"
The sergeant asked, pausing at the door. "Only the usual," Purbright said. "Keep an ear open." "For what, sir?"
"For the next sound worth hearing." Mally frowned, uncertain, then nodded and left. The station fell still again.
Purbright took a final look at his notes before locking them away in the cabinet. When he turned out the lamp, the shadows stretched softly across the room, blending the day into its quiet conclusion. Outside, the sun began to slip behind the rooftops, gilding the tower's edge in amber light. For the first time since the funeral, a faint breeze stirred the bell rope, making it sway gently without sound. It was not enough to ring, only enough to remind. Flaxborough would not speak of the matter again. By Monday, the talk would turn to council repairs and flower shows, and the bell's misbehaviour would be remembered as a quaint incident rather than an omen. Yet somewhere in the hush, between the town's routines, Inspector Purbright knew the echo of that one wrong note lingered, an echo that did not accuse, merely observed. He stepped outside at last, closing the station door behind him. The cobblestones gleamed faintly from an earlier drizzle. The air was neither warm nor cold, simply balanced, as though the town had exhaled. He looked toward the church one final time, its tower outlined against the fading light, and smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that belonged to a man who understood the nature of peace too well to trust it. He walked away down the narrow lane toward his modest house, the sound of his shoes soft against the stones. Behind him, the church remained perfectly still. No bell, no whispers, no audience.
Only the kind of silence that follows a confession properly heard.